What's up? Today, I want to talk about why Flesh and Blood is inherently different from games like fighting games, StarCraft, chess, right? And for a long time when I started playing the game, people would describe Flesh and Blood as a fighting game, which was really weird to me because I've played a bunch of fighting games, right? I started playing Super Smash Bros. Melee in like 2014, and then from there played like Grand Blue, Eunice, Street Fighter, uh, currently, I'm just jamming 2XKO. And fighting games are just like so inherently different for a lot of different reasons, but ultimately, Flesh and Blood is a game about cards and deck. And I wanted to create an image that I guess showed like the amount of skill expressiveness between different like competitive sports or other esports, stuff like that. Right. So, first of all, you can look at like coin flipping, right? Like, obviously, coin flipping, it's not very skill expressive. Somebody names heads, somebody names tails, and then it's a 50-50, right? And then like Magic the Gathering is definitely more skill expressive than flipping a coin. However, it's pretty like, the best players are winning like 65% of the time maybe. They can't like flex their muscles and like win every single tournament, even though sometimes it can feel that way. And then obviously chess and like other games like it, like Go, Shogi, those sorts of games where there is no inherent difference between the two players. The only difference is going first and going second. Well, in those games, right, like the best players in the world, like will literally never lose to somebody who's like a little bit worse than them, and then like only the best players in the world can really like fight each other for points. And then you've got games like StarCraft and Street Fighter, which are quite skill expressive, I would say. The fighting games is kind of all fighting games are kind of included under Street Fighter. Some are more skill expressive than others, right? Like you have more control over your character in some games, and like the old Street Fighter games are a lot of times dominated by people who were very good at the game, right? But some of the new games, there's just so many people playing that are good that it's hard to tell who's like the best sometimes. And then like StarCraft Brood War, obviously, if you're godlike in that game, you're dominating so hard that like nobody's touching you unless they're also like a similar skill level. But then you talk about Flesh and Blood, and Flesh and Blood I feel like people want to think of Flesh and Blood as closer to like the StarCraft side of things and the Street Fighter side of things, right? Because and that was part of Flesh and Blood's original, hook is that like, oh, the best Magic players are only winning this amount of the time, but then the best Flesh and Blood players are winning like this amount of the time. And oh, isn't it cool that you can be so good at this game? And yeah, right, you can have more skill in Flesh and Blood, and that decides the match more often. But I mean, we're not even close to here. We're much closer to the Magic side of things than like StarCraft or Street Fighter. Now, you might not think this matters, and it doesn't really matter, but I think there's two reasons why you might want to take this into account. The first one has to do with the tournament experience. When you play in a tournament, you play matchups, and those matchups are decided by the tools that your character is given. That's the same in StarCraft, it's the same in Street Fighter, it's the same in all card games, right? I guess in Magic it's determined by like the tools that your deck has. But like in fighting games, you are given a character, and that character has a set of tools, right? But those tools are quite flexible, and you actually have quite a lot of them, right? In StarCraft, it's the same, right? Like you can pick Terrans or Protoss, but those races have a bunch of different tools that you can be using. And Flesh and Blood also has a lot of tools. And lately, I've been thinking about Flesh and Blood matchups pretty differently to what I used to, where I used to think that Flesh and Blood hero matchups were pretty stratified, and a lot of the times, like, it would be impossible for some heroes to beat other heroes. And I feel like that used to be more the case, right? Like, especially old Prism versus some of the Guardians and the Warriors, where, like, they just couldn't do anything. But in New Flesh and Blood, I think most of the time, if you could build your deck for just one matchup, you could get that matchup to be pretty good, basically no matter what deck you're playing, as long as that deck meets certain standardization for deck power level. Obviously, modern design likes to play around with this. You know, they're throwing in gravy because gravy changes the way you're required to build your deck. They throw in earth because earth changes the way you're required to build your deck. But what this means is that in Flesh and Blood, you are required to build your deck in specific ways to try and have the best amount of matchups the best matchups possible, right? As far as the spread goes. The thing about Flesh and Blood is that when you discuss matchup win percentages, it's different than it is in fighting games. When you discuss a matchup in Flesh and Blood, if you say something is a 6-4, you're obviously saying, okay, if you're both similar skill level, then if you play 10 matches, the deck that's 6 will win 6 games, and the deck that's 4 will win 4 games. And it's the same in fighting games, right? The character that is 6 will win 6 games, and the character that's 4 will win 4, if you're the same skill level. But the difference is that in fighting games, similar skill level is not a thing that exists. People will discuss matchups in this way as a framework to discuss tools for characters, right? But discussing actual matchup win rate almost never correlates with anything to do with what the matchup win rate actually looks like. And that is because good players beat bad players an overwhelming majority of the time in fighting games. Much more often than in Flesh and Blood, right? What this means is when you play a big tournament in a fighting game, by the way, they don't even play Swiss, they play double elimination. And the best players make it very far in bracket every time, because they always beat bad players, even in bad matchups, right? This is not the case in Flesh and Blood. If I play a bad matchup in Flesh and Blood, and I haven't set my deck up to prepare for the matchup, even if my opponent is worse than me, sometimes even significantly worse than me, it might be impossible for me to win, right? And like when I was a bad player, I was playing Prism, and I'd play against like decks that could not beat Prism, and then I would win, even though I was significantly worse than my opponent as a player, right? In fighting games, if you're significantly worse than your opponent as a player, but like you're playing a good matchup, well, you still lose like a lot. So what this means is when you enter a tournament, in fighting games, you can expect a stratified meta of players who are attempting to be competitive. I will simply beat all of the bad players, and then after I've beaten all the bad players, the good players are left, and the good players are playing a specific meta of characters. This is not the case in Flesh and Blood. In Flesh and Blood, sometimes a bad deck wins randomly, right? Like maybe Teklevossen randomly gets matched up into its best matchup, right? Like it gets matched up into like a warrior or something and can kill them, I don't know. Teklevossen probably has a good matchup. And then suddenly there's a Teklevossen at the winning tables, right? Like maybe they get a bye round 1 and then round 2 they get their free matchup. And so suddenly you're 2-0 at this tournament in Flesh and Blood out of like 9 rounds, and you're playing against Teklevossen, and your deck can't beat Teklevossen for whatever reason, right? In fighting games, if that were the case, your opponent, Teklevossen, probably wouldn't be a good player because good players don't play Teklevossen, and then they would just lose because they're worse than you. This is not the case in Flesh and Blood. In Flesh and Blood, the matchups matter a lot. And so sometimes weird matchups just happen and you just lose, right? And sometimes the matchup doesn't even matter. Sometimes you draw cards and those cards can't kill your opponent and you die. What this means is that when you are playing in a Flesh and Blood tournament, you can't depend on a stratified meta after you win a certain amount of rounds like you can in a fighting game tournament. Like the winner's meta exists to a degree, but not even close to how much it exists in fighting games. So this means that instead of building my deck completely around some specific matchups, maybe I should think, okay, I should probably have some game plans for these decks that are like theoretically terrible, but you know, they could get up there through a little bit of luck and then I'd have to play against them, right? Like let's say Kano is just like objectively bad in the meta, but like sometimes the Kano gets lucky and plays cards and then their opponent dies and now you're playing against Kano. Well, you'd much prefer to have Kano hate than not have Kano hate. In fighting games, like you play against a person who's worse than you and you just kill them. And that's not to say that like these sorts of matchups never existed, right? Like when I first started playing, Krenovsky's Oldham Heroes were very interesting because you had basically complete control of your pitch deck and you got there very fast. So there's a battle between you and your opponent on what your pitch stacks would look like, and then how your pitch stack would affect your opponent's pitch stack. And so like if you could get something pitched like earlier or later than your opponent to counter what they were doing, then you could be heavily favored in that matchup. Flesh and Blood has explicitly designed away from that. There was some article where, or maybe it was a dev talk, where they stated they were trying to move towards variance and away from these sorts of decks. That's not to say that modern Flesh and Blood decks aren't extremely difficult, right? Obviously, decks like Acilio and Gravy are extremely difficult to play. But these decks all depend on probability and are not as deterministic as things like Oldhim and Chain were. Where Chain, you just like pitch stacked a combo that dealt like 40 damage and left a 6 attack minion on your board with 6 health. And then Oldhim just like got the second cycle like on turn 10 or whatever, and then like Oaken ulted you 3 times and you like exploded, right? Gravy instead is looking at probability, and you're making complex decisions based on, okay, how many blues are left in my deck? What cards do I want to draw here? Do I have enough power to actually beat my opponent? Do I need more power, or is the amount of power I currently have in my hand and graveyard enough for me to be able to win, right? And then Acilio's thinking, okay, do I pop my combo now? Will I be drawing blocking cards, and if I'm required to on the next turn? Do I need to go off now, or can I afford to go off later? Right? All these things are very important to Acilio, but they're not deterministic. And it's that determinism that is really why fighting games are much more, I guess, stratified than, Flesh and Blood tournaments are. Is that in fighting games, when you're better than your opponent, you can deterministically kill them because of a bunch of different reasons. And then in Flesh and Blood, well, sometimes you draw your cards and you lose. Now let's talk about the other thing that I want to discuss concerning the determinism in Flesh and Blood and how that affects your improvement process, right? So when you try to improve in Flesh and Blood, and when you start as a player, you think, okay, there are good players in my scene, I will build a deck and I will go to Armory and I will play cards, and then sometimes I will win and sometimes I'll lose. And then you go to your Armory, you build a deck and you lose a lot, but then suddenly, slowly you start winning, right? And then when you lose a lot and win sometimes, your brain wants to emphasize the times that you sometimes win because it's the thing that happens less, right? But once you start becoming a good player and win most of the time, the opposite thing starts to happen. You start to emphasize the thing that happens less, which is the losing, right? So Flesh and Blood sets you up to fail as far as ego goes, because you're emphasizing these wins and building up your ego through wins, and then by the time you start winning a lot, you suddenly start losing due to variance or due to getting outplayed by an opponent who you thought was worse than you, or getting outplayed by an opponent who was better than you, or you think was better than you. And then you think, oh, I suck because I lost. Well, in Flesh and Blood, sometimes you lose, right? Sometimes you lose and there's nothing to learn from it. Oftentimes there is something to learn from it, but no. What does this mean? Well, it means that you can't depend on going to an Armory and getting some random wins to determine how good you are at Flesh and Blood, because your brain is very bad at that. Your brain cannot determine how good you are at Flesh and Blood based on your win percentage at Armories, because your brain does not understand things in terms of percentages. Your brain understands, ooh, I won this game and I lost this game. If you want a results-based metric for how good you are at Flesh and Blood, you must go to many, many, many tournaments that are more competitive than an Armory, and then think about your win percentage over time, write it down, and analyze it, right? That's if you're looking for a results-based metric, which is totally fine to do, but you need to understand, like, going to Armories and getting some wins is not results-based. That's all in your mind. If you want to figure out how to determine your improvement and how to determine how to improve without having to go to, like, 12 competitive tournaments a year, then what you should do is be analyzing your gameplay. And I've put out some info on how to analyze gameplay, but I don't want to go into it too hard here, but you basically just record your gameplay, look through your turns, determine how you're making mistakes and what part of the games you're making mistakes. And then the real secret is that you're never actually good at Flesh and Blood. Because everybody makes mistakes in Flesh and Blood all the time because the game is very difficult. Right? So you will never be good at Flesh and Blood, but you might be better at Flesh and Blood, right? So the goal is to reduce the amount of mistakes that you're making. What that means is that you just need to be able to notice your own mistakes before they happen, right? If you know, oh, I prefer attacking over blocking. And sometimes even if a line is like more value on blocks, I prefer to keep it and attack. Well, that might be a mistake. And you can determine that by going over your game plans, going over your gameplay, both of them, and then figuring out, okay, I'm going to be blocking more in this specific circumstance, but sometimes it's okay in these specific circumstances, right? Like, there's a bunch of stuff to it. But basically, it involves watching your gameplay, seeing when you make mistakes, and then once you've seen them enough, eventually you'll see them in real life when you're actually making the decisions. That's all I got today. This is kind of a clickbaity video because like it's not really about like is Flesh and Blood a fighting game. It's more like about how variance is affecting your improvement and ego. But I think it's an interesting topic, so I'll see y'all later.